The past never truly dies in the Kaliningrad Oblast. It lies buried in the thin soil, a silent, metallic geology of a forgotten war. Alexei Volkov knew this better than anyone. A historian and battlefield archaeologist, he had spent a decade translating the rust and ruin of the Eastern Front into coherent history. But today, in the damp cathedral silence of the Lesnaya Grove, he was chasing a ghost. Not a ghost of a man, but of a machine. The lead was a fragment itself, a single paragraph in the digitized memoir of a Red Army artillery observer, Captain Pyotr Semenov, dated March 20th, 1945. The text was dry, military, until one line broke the pattern. Our forward position reported contact with enemy armor near Grid 79er. Description contradicts all known intelligence. Units reported Volst, Ndig e Panzer, completely white tanks, moving without sound through the blizzard. Engagement was unsuccessful. No thermal signature, no clear silhouette. Command has logged it as a mass hallucination due to exhaustion. I am not so sure. What I saw through the periscope was not a hallucination. It was a predator. Mass hallucination. That's what the archives had deemed it. But Alexei's grandfather, an artilleryman himself who fought in the same brutal East Prussian campaign, had spoken of them once, feverish on his deathbed.
White shadows, swallowing men whole. The old man's hand had gripped his with a desperate strength.
It was this memory, not just the document, that led Alexei here. He stood now in a shallow depression, a place his cross-referenced maps and terrain analysis suggested was a possible blind spot, a place where something could hide or be hidden. The air was frigid, spring, still a distant promise. His metal detector, a high-sensitivity pulse induction unit, whined a steady, negative tone in his headphones. He moved with a slow, grid-like precision, his eyes scanning the ground for the subtle, telltale signs. A dip in the earth, a strange arrangement of stones, a patch of vegetation different from the rest. An hour passed, then two. The cold seeped through his boots. Doubt, that constant companion of the field researcher, began to whisper. Then the tone changed. It was a shriek, a digital howl of pure, concentrated metal. Not the faint chirp of a shell fragment or a spent casing. This was a deep, resonant signal, indicating a large, dense object. Adrenaline, sharp and clean, burned away the fatigue. He marked the spot with his GPS, the coordinates glowing on the screen like a secret. He set the detector aside and took up his small, sharp-edged excavation trowel. He did not dig recklessly. He brushed. He scraped. Layer by layer, he peeled back the forest floor, the mat of brown pine needles, the black loamy soil, the tangled web of roots. His trowel struck something with a dull, solid clink. Not stone. He cleared more earth, his breaths coming faster, fogging in the cold air. A shape emerged, curved, not flat. It was a piece of armor plate, jagged and torn along one edge as if by a colossal force. It was about 1 meter long. He worked his fingers around its edge and, with a grunt, pried it from the earth's grip. He rolled it over, and the world shrunk to the piece of steel in his hands. One side was scorched and blackened, etched by the heat of an explosion. The other side, the side that had been pressed face down into the cold earth for nearly 80 years, was pristine. It was coated in a thick, chalky white substance. Not a wash, not a hasty layer of lime. This was a professional, factory-grade enamel, applied in multiple layers. It had a faint, almost pearlescent quality, and embedded in it were tiny, granular particles that caught the weak light and refracted it. It was designed not just to be white, but to break up light, to scatter it. And on this white field, painted not with stencil, but with an artist's careful hand, was an emblem, a tiger's head. But unlike any unit insignia Alexei had ever seen, this tiger was spectral, skeletal. Its lines were sharp and angular, rendered in a stark, icy blue-gray. It lacked eyes, only dark sockets. It was less an animal and more a symbol of cold, silent predation. Weyer tiger. The words from the memoir echoed in his mind. This was their mark. It was real. A wave of vertigo hit him. The quiet of the woods became oppressive, a held breath. He carefully set the plate down, his mind racing. This was no ordinary wreck. This was something else, something purpose-built, hidden from all records. He returned to the hole with his detector. The machine screamed again, just off to the side. He dug, his movements less careful now, driven by a rising electric urgency. His fingers closed around a small, flat object. An Erkennungsmark, the soldier's identity disc. He rubbed the dirt away on his glove. The stamped inscription was clear. Stammrollen nur 14, 2 PZ Ersatz U Ausbedapt 500. A replacement battalion. But the number, 500. That number rang a distant, ominous bell. It was associated with experimental units, with projects that lived and died in the gray margins of the Nazi war machine. As he stared at the disc, a sensory memory from his grandfather, vivid and unbidden, flashed in his mind, the smell of ozone and cold iron. At the same instant, a physical sensation washed over him, a deep, subsonic vibration that seemed to come up through the ground into his bones. It was the ghost of a feeling, a phantom tremor. It lasted only a second, followed by an absolute deafening silence where even the wind in the pines seemed to pause. He looked from the disc to the white plate with its ghost tiger emblem. This was not merely a historical find. This was a key. And as he sat there in the cold mud, the realization dawned with a chilling certainty. He had not just found a piece of a tank. He had found a piece of a secret. And secrets, especially ones buried so deep and guarded by such a symbol, are rarely meant to stay buried. The white plate seemed to glare up at him. A blind, cold eye opened after a long sleep. The hunt was over. The investigation had just begun, and Alexei Volkov felt, for the first time, that he was not the hunter. He was the one who had been lured. The discovery in the Lesnaya Grove did not feel like a triumph. It felt like a transgression. Back in his small, cluttered apartment in Kaliningrad, the white armor plate leaned against a bookshelf, dominating the room. It was no longer just steel and paint. It was an accusation. It made the familiar spines of his history books seem hollow, their narratives incomplete, their truths conditional. The ghost tiger emblem watched with its empty sockets. The dog tag lay on his desk, a cold, hard fact. Stammrollen Nummer 14, man number 14. Who were the other 13? What were they a part of? Alexei's world telescoped into a single obsessive focus. The digital realm became his new excavation site. He began in the known, reputable databases, the Bundesarchive, digitized Nara holdings, Russian Ministry of Defense declassified files. He searched for Weyer Tiger, for Panzer Winter Camouflage Experimental, for Sonderkommando East Prussia 1945. The results were a desert. Official histories were silent. Order of battle records showed no anomalous, white-painted battalions in the area. It was as if the ground had not just swallowed the tanks, but their very existence from the paperwork of the war. This silence was the first real clue. In the meticulously documented insanity of the Third Reich, an absence this profound was not an accident. It was a deliberate scrub, a black hole in the record. Someone with significant authority had made these machines, and the men who crewed them, disappear on paper before they had even disappeared in the field. Frustration was a constant companion, gnawing at him. He expanded his search, moving from tactical to logistical records. He cross-referenced procurement orders, shipment manifests from paint manufacturers, fuel allocation dossiers for panzer units in the winter of 1944-45. He worked through nights, the blue light of his monitors the only illumination, the white plate a pale monolith in the periphery of his vision. And then, in a scanned ledger from a long-defunct chemical plant in Leipzig, he found a fissure in the void. Not a mention of tigers or special units, but an order, a massive, disproportionate order for a titanium zinc oxide-based paint, color designation Eislicht, Ice Light. The quantity was enough to coat an entire company of tanks, not just once, but with multiple coats. The shipment destination was not a frontline depot. It was the Heeresversuchsstelle, the Army Proving Grounds at Kummersdorf, and the date was November 15, 1944. A specific dead-end command was appended: FR Projekt Nibelung, Priorit, TA, Lieferung direkt an Sonderwerkstatt 3. For Project Nibelung, Priority A, delivery directly to Special Workshop 3. Project Nibelung. The name was a myth, a saga of hidden treasure and oblivion. His fingers flew across the keyboard. A search for Nibelung and Kummersdorf yielded nothing, but a search for Sonderwerkstatt 3 and Panzer led him down a rabbit hole of fragmented technical forums, where enthusiasts argued over blurred photographs and factory floor plans. Workshop 3 was a legend itself, a sealed hangar within Kummersdorf, where Dr. Ernst von Feldman, a brilliant, reclusive automotive engineer, seconded from Porsche, had conducted his special projects. Von Feldman was known for one thing: an obsession with thermal efficiency and engine performance in sub-zero conditions. He had written papers on cold weather ignition systems, insulated fuel lines, and radiant heat retention for crew compartments. He was a theorist of winter. But in late 1944, Dr. von Feldman vanished from all official correspondence. The trail went as cold as the conditions he studied. Alexei leaned back, his neck stiff. He was looking at the wrong man. The engineer built the tool. But who wielded it? Who was given a weapon of invisibility and silence in the final, desperate winter of the war? He shifted tactics. He began searching for officers with expertise in winter warfare, in irregular tactics, who were abruptly reassigned or listed as zur besonderen Verwendung, for special assignment, in that fateful November time frame. The name that surfaced was like a sharp, clear note in the static. Oberstleutnant Erich von J.R.G., a Prussian aristocrat, a veteran of the Demyansk pocket, where the Wehrmacht had been surrounded and sustained through a brutal winter in 1942. His after-action reports were clinical masterpieces. He emphasized mobility in deep snow, small unit independence, the psychological impact of sudden, silent attacks. He was decorated, respected, and in October 1944, he was pulled from command of an elite Panzer Grenadier Regiment on the Western Front. His personnel file simply stated, Abkommandiert zum OKHF dar Sonderaufgaben, transferred to Army High Command for special duties. After that, nothing. Alexei found a single grainy photograph of von J.R.G., a tall, lean man with a hawkish profile and eyes that held no warmth, only a calculating intensity. He was not looking at the camera. He was looking through it, into a distance only he could see. This was a man who could command ghosts. This was the architect. A new theory, chilling in its implication, began to form in Alexei's mind. He was no longer looking for a lost unit. He was looking for a prototype, a field test. What if Project Nibelung was not about creating a new tank, but about transforming an existing one into something else entirely? A predator perfectly adapted to one final apocalyptic winter. What if von J.R.G. was the tactician and von Feldman the engineer? And what if their creation, their white tigers, were so effective or so terrifying that their very existence was scrubbed clean by a collapsing regime wanting to bury its most dangerous secrets? He looked again at the white plate. The eyes-licked paint. The granular particles weren't just for camouflage. They were for diffusion, for breaking up not just visual shape, but maybe thermal signature? He thought of his grandfather's words. Eo edanyea. Ia io auia idinyo edanyeye. Ia auia eeea. Like skin. The void in the archives was no longer empty. It was a shape now. It had a name, Project Nibelung. It had an engineer, von Feldman. It had a commander, von J.R.G. And it had a material witness, right here in his apartment, staring back at him with sightless eyes. The hunt had moved from the silent forest to the silent pages of history, and the silence was beginning to scream. The digital trail had hit a wall. Project Nibelung, Oberstleutnant von J.R.G., Dr. von Feldman. These were names etched on smoke. They pointed to a conspiracy of silence, not to a tangible reality. Alexei needed to connect the spectral unit to flesh and blood, to the mundane details of life that even the most thorough bureaucratic purge might miss. His mind kept returning to the dog tag. Stammrollen 14 man number 14. He had a number, a replacement battalion designation. He needed a name. He turned from the vast, cold databases to the intimate, human-scale ones. Regional German war graves commissions, Veterans Association registries, digitized rolls of the missing. He cross-referenced the replacement battalion number with soldiers listed as missing in action in East Prussia in the spring of 1945. It was a grim, numbing process, scrolling through lists of the lost. Hours bled into another night. Then a match, a single entry. Gefreiter Lucas Faber. Born 1925 in Freiburg. Drafted 1943. Transferred to Panzerersatz- und Ausbildungsabteilung 500 in November 1940. Listed as vermisst, missing, since March 28, 1945, in the vicinity of Heiligenbeil, the very cauldron of the East Prussian siege. The service number appended to the record was a sequential match. This was him. Man number 14. Lucas Faber. The record had a last known address for next of kin, a street in Freiburg. A follow-up search of modern German residential databases showed nothing for that name at that address. But death notices, posted in local Freiburg newspapers in the early 2000s, yielded a result. An Elsa Faber had passed away. Her listed survivor was a daughter, Karin Weber, with an address in a suburb of Stuttgart. This was a thread, thin and fragile, stretching across decades. Alexei hesitated. Contacting a stranger about a relative lost in the worst war in history, based on a fragment of metal he dug from the ground, was a profound intrusion. But the pull of the white plate was gravitational.
He composed a careful, respectful email to Karen Weber, identifying himself as a researcher, mentioning the discovery of an artifact near Kaliningrad that might be connected to a Gefreiter Lucas Faber, and asking if the family had any wartime memorabilia that could help with historical clarification. He sent it into the digital ether, expecting silence or a polite refusal. The reply came less than 24 hours later. It was brief, curt, but not hostile. I have my mother's things. There is a small box. You may look if you come. No promises. Attached was an address. It was not an invitation, it was a test. A week later, Alexei stood in the tidy, sunlit living room of a suburban Stuttgart home. Karin Weber was a woman in her 60s, with a careful, reserved demeanor. She offered no smile, only a firm handshake and an appraising look. She had a small, lacquered wooden box on the coffee table. "My mother rarely spoke of him," she said, her voice quiet. "She was a young bride. He was just a boy. All she had was this, what they sent back when he was first reported missing, before the official notice came." She opened the box. Inside were the fragile Browning artifacts of a lost life. A few letters tied with a ribbon, a black and white photograph of a smiling young man in uniform that made Alexei's breath catch. He looked painfully young, his eyes bright with a life not yet lived. A pressed Edelweiss flower, and a small, leather-bound notebook. "He liked to draw," Karin said, nodding to the notebook. He wrote to her about it, said it passed the time. She could never bring herself to look at it after. She said it was a door to a room she could never enter. With her permission, Alexei put on a pair of archival gloves. He lifted the notebook from the box. The leather was dry, cracked. He opened it carefully. The first pages were innocent enough. Sketches of barracks life, a clumsy portrait of a comrade, a detailed drawing of a Panzer IV engine. Then, as he turned the pages, the winter set in. The sketches became dominated by snow, by bleak landscapes, by huddled men in greatcoats. The style grew sharper, more assured, yet darker. And then, Alexei found them. They were not photographs. They were better. They were observations frozen in pencil and charcoal, seen through the eyes of the boy who became man number 14.
A page titled simply, Sonderkommando W, January 45. The first drawing was a side profile of a tank. It was unmistakably a panther, the sloping glacis, the distinctive road wheels. But it was wrong. It was clothed in a thick, rippling layer of what looked like fur or a heavy blanket of snow, rendered with obsessive cross-hatching. Wide, overhanging tracks, like snowshoes, replaced the standard ones. The exhaust system was encased in a bulky, box-like housing, and it was utterly, completely white, the paper left blank, but for the shadows, making the machine look like a carved block of ice. The next page was a close-up of the rear hull, showing a complex, bundled apparatus of pipes and insulated hoses labeled in Faber's neat hand. Heizkreislauf, Motor, Mannschaftsraum, heating circuit engine yacht crew compartment. Another showed 3 of these white beasts moving in a loose V formation through a blizzard, their outlines blurred and merging with the storm. The perspective was from behind one of them, looking out. Scribbled at the bottom, Unsichtbarkeit ist unser Mantel. Der Schnee spricht für uns. Invisibility is our cloak. The snow speaks for us. The most chilling page was not of machines, but of men. A crew, 4 of them, standing before their white steel beast. They were young, like Faber. They did not smile. They looked exhausted, hardened, their eyes shadowed but burning with a fierce, fanatical resolve. They wore unique padded white overalls and hoods, and on the turret behind them, clear as day, was the emblem, the skeletal, eyeless head of the white tiger. Alexei's hands were steady, but his mind was roaring. Here was the proof, not in a state archive, but in the private, sacred memory of a lost boy. He wasn't just looking at technical drawings. He was looking at a frontline soldier's testament to his own secret reality. The ice-licked paint was real. The modifications were real. The symbol was real. He turned the final page with a sketch. It was a hasty, almost frantic composition. It showed the white tanks, not in formation, but in a defensive ring in a dark, wooded clearing. The lines were jagged, nervous. One of the panthers was depicted with a jagged black scorch mark on its flank. And in the margin, a single phrase, written large and underlined, the pencil nearly tearing through the paper. J. Arg's Befehl, verschluckt werden, nicht kapitulieren. J. Arg's order, to be swallowed, not to capitulate. Alexei slowly closed the notebook. The comfortable suburban room felt alien, a fragile bubble over a chasm of history. He looked from the youthful, smiling face in the photograph to the haunted, determined faces in the sketch, to the grieving daughter sitting across from him. Lucas Faber was no longer a number on a dog tag. He was a boy who drew pictures, who loved a girl, who was given a white steel monster to crew, and who vanished into the snow under an order to be swallowed. The mystery had just gained a heartbreaking human soul. The ghost had a face and a name, and the order from von J. Argy hung in the air, a dark omen of what was to come. The sketches from Lucas Faber's notebook were a seismic event. They transformed the inquiry from a historical puzzle into a visceral, human drama. But they were still one side of the story, the view from inside the white steel beast. Alexei needed the other side. He needed to find what happened when the predator met its prey. He needed someone who had stared into the blizzard and seen the ghost tigers emerge. His search through Soviet veteran rolls for the Heiligenbeil area was a monumental task, a needle in a haystack of millions. But he had a new, crucial filter: the date. Faber was listed as missing on March 28, 1945. Alexei cross-referenced this with Soviet unit combat logs from the 3rd Belarusian Front, focusing on artillery and anti-tank regiments known to be operating in the final reduction of the Heiligenbeil pocket. The name surfaced with the grim efficiency of fate. In the log of the 87th Guards Anti-Tank Artillery Regiment, an entry for March 28th noted, "Position near elevation 72.3 engaged unidentified enemy armor. Limited visibility due to snowfall. No confirmed kills. One gun, serial 4087, disabled by precise return fire. Gun Commander Guard Senior Sergeant Ivan Petrovich Gorshkov, wounded." A follow-up in the regiment's casualty list showed Gorshkov, Ivan Petrovich, was evacuated with shrapnel wounds to the leg and later discharged. A search of the National Veterans Database gave him a 92% probability of being alive, residing in a small town in the Vologda Oblast. This was the thread: a living witness. Alexei's request for a meeting sent through the local Veterans Administration was met with a long silence. Then a phone call. A raspy, aged voice, suspicious but curious. "You have questions about the white tanks?" the voice said, the words weighted with decades of memory. "Nobody asks about them. Nobody believed us then." "Why now?" After a long conversation, Ivan Petrovich agreed. "Come, I will tell you what I saw. Once, for the record."
The journey to the remote Vologda village was a passage into a different Russia, a place where the 21st century felt like a faint rumor. Ivan Petrovich's cottage was small, sturdy, surrounded by birch trees. The old man who opened the door was a monument carved from time itself. Tall, stooped, with hands gnarled like tree roots, and eyes of pale, clear blue that held a startling, undimmed sharpness. He moved with a pronounced limp, the legacy of March 28, 1945. He led Alexei into a Spartan sitting room. A single medal, the Order of the Red Star, lay in a case on a shelf. He did not offer tea or small talk. He simply sat, folded his hands in his lap, and looked at a point on the wall, as if looking through it, back across the miles and the years. Elevation 72-3, he began, his voice a low gravel. It was not a hill. It was a muddy, frozen blister of earth overlooking a frozen creek and a strip of woodland. A killing zone. We had two 76mm guns dug in, my crew and another. The snow was not falling. It was dancing. A horizontal, blinding madness. Visibility was 50 meters, then 20. You heard the war before you saw it, the distant thunder of the pocket collapsing to the west. But our slice of front was quiet, eerily quiet. He described the cold, a cold that seeped into the metal of the guns, into bones, into souls. The weight. Then a sound. It was not the sound of a tank engine, not the deep roar of a tiger, or the whine of a T-34. It was a hum, a low, vibrating hum, like a beehive buried in the earth. And it was muffled, wrapped in felt. My loader heard it first. He said, "Comrade Sergeant, the ground is purring." Ivan Petrovich leaned forward, his gaze now locked on Alexei. They did not come from the front. They emerged from the tree line to our left flank, materializing from the white chaos like ships from a fog. One, then two, then a third. Completely white. Not painted white. They were white. The snow clung to them in strange, smooth layers. They had no sharp edges. They were ghosts. And they were silent. No shouting of commanders. No radio crackle. They moved with a horrible fluid coordination, like a single organism. He described the attack. It was not a charge. It was a methodical, surgical dissection. The lead white tank stopped, its turret rotating with an unnerving smoothness. There was no muzzle flash from the main gun, just a dull thump that was swallowed by the storm, and the neighboring gun position erupted in a geyser of snow, earth, and shattered metal. They did not fire at the gun. They fired at the ammunition crate beside it. One shot. One kill. Maximum efficiency. No waste. His own crew swung their gun around, the traverse hand wheel spinning frantically. We got off one shot. I saw the tracer fly, and then it simply vanished into the white hull of the closest one. No spark, no explosion. It was like throwing a stone into a snowdrift. A non-event. The return fire was not a shell. It was a storm of high-velocity machine gun fire that stitched across their position, not wildly, but in a precise pattern, slicing traversing gears, shattering the gun shield's optics. A shard of steel found his leg. The world dissolved into pain, shouting, and the relentless, humming silence of the advancing white shapes. And then they stopped. Ivan Petrovich said, his voice dropping to a whisper. The three of them were just there, surrounding our shattered position. My crew was dragging me back. I looked up. The hatch on the lead tank opened. A figure stood there, silhouetted. Not in black, in white. He did not look at us. He looked past us, into the blizzard to the east. He just observed. for a full minute in that hell. Then, without a sound, he dropped back inside. The hatches closed, and they turned. Not in a sharp maneuver. They pivoted on the spot, like wolves deciding the hunt was over. And they slid back into the white curtain. The humming faded. First to a whisper, then to nothing. The snow filled their tracks in minutes. He fell silent for a long time. The room held the weight of the memory. The debriefing officers called it panic, hallucination, said we were exhausted, that we'd seen panthers with frost on them. But I saw their eyes. Through my periscope, in a lull in the snow, I saw the emblem on the turret. A white animal skull. A tiger, I think. I told them. They wrote it down and never spoke of it again. The old man fixed Alexei with his piercing gaze. They were not there to win a battle. That pocket was doomed. They were there to test, to prove they could be ghosts, that they could move, kill, and vanish. And they did. Now you tell me, historian, what did we see that day? Alexei had no answer that would suffice. He showed the old man a photograph of Faber's sketchbook page, the one with the defensive ring and the scorched tank. Ivan Petrovitch's breath hitched. His finger, trembling slightly, touched the image of the black scorch mark. "That one," he rasped. "The second one. Our shot. It did not penetrate, but it left a mark. We touched it. We were not just ghosts to them. For a moment we made them real." He sat back, exhausted by the excavation of memory. Their greatest weapon was not the gun or the armor, it was the silence. In war, noise is life. Engines, radios, shouts, explosions. Their silence, it was death itself. It swallowed everything. As Alexei left the cottage, the pristine silence of the Vologda forest felt different. It was no longer peaceful. It was a medium that could hide things. Ivan Petrovitch had not just given him testimony. He had given him the sound of the mystery, a deep, unsettling hum, and a silence more terrifying than any explosion. The white tigers were no longer just a visual anomaly. They were a sensory weapon, and their echo had just been heard, clear and chilling, across the span of a lifetime. The encounter with Ivan Petrovitch was a fulcrum. It moved the investigation from the realm of documents and sketches into the visceral sensory reality of combat. The old artilleryman's testimony provided the crucial external data point, the sighting that perfectly corroborated the internal view from Faber's sketches. Now, armed with both perspectives, Alexei could begin the most critical phase, reverse engineering the ghost. He returned to his apartment, which had transformed from a scholar's den into a war room. The white armor plate was the centerpiece, but now it was surrounded by large printouts. Faber's detailed sketches, grainy photos of Panther Aus G-tanks, thermal imaging charts, and Ivan Petrovitch's described engagement area map. Alexei's collaborator, the German archivist Thomas, joined him via a persistent video link. His own workspace in Berlin, a mirror of scattered files and intense focus. Their goal was no longer to prove the tigers existed, but to understand how, to dissect the logic of their invisibility. They started with the most obvious yet most baffling element, the white. Thomas had dug deeper into the ice-licked paint order. The titanium zinc oxide base was standard for durability, but the attached technical annex, once deciphered, revealed the secret. The paint was to be mixed with a powdered additive, milled quartz, and microscopic glass beads. "It's not just paint," Thomas said, his voice tight with excitement through the speakers. "It's a diffuse reflector. The quartz scatters visible light in all directions, eliminating glare and shadow, blending the outline. The glass beads, They have a high albedo for thermal infrared. They wouldn't make it cold, but they would blur its heat signature, make it a fuzzy, indistinct blob against the cold ground, not a sharp, hot engine block. It was a primitive yet breathtakingly effective form of multispectral camouflage. It explained why Ivan Petrovich's tracer seemed to vanish, and why the tanks had no clear silhouette. Next, the silence. Faber's sketch of the insulated exhaust housing was key. Alexei cross-referenced it with late-war German engineering reports on Schallschluckende Abgassanlagen, sound-swallowing exhaust systems. They were experiments for command vehicles and reconnaissance units. The principle was a series of baffled chambers and wool matrix absorbers that would drastically reduce the acoustic signature. Combined with wide, rubber-padded Winterketten tracks designed for snow, not metal cleats on pavement, the machine's audible footprint would drop to that eerie, ground-hugging hum. It wasn't total silence. It was something worse. An unnatural, low-frequency presence that felt wrong. Then, the thermal efficiency. This was Dr. von Feldman's domain. Thomas located fragments of his theoretical papers. The man was obsessed with Abbenutzung, waste heat utilization. The bundled hoses Faber drew weren't just for crew comfort. They were part of a closed-loop system. It would capture engine coolant heat and reroute it not only to the crew compartment, but also along the outer skin of the hull in a regulated, diffuse pattern. The purpose was sinister genius: to prevent the tank's exterior from becoming a stark, cold spot against the slightly warmer snow, another telltale sign for infrared scopes. The tank would present a uniform, muted thermal profile. It would be spectrally neutral. Piece by agonizing piece, the Phantom took shape in their analysis. It was not a new superweapon. It was a Panther, meticulously and expensively optimized. Stripped of all identifying markings, fitted with specialized equipment for one specific environment: the deep winter of the Eastern Front. Its armor was not thicker, but its signature was thinner in every conceivable spectrum. Its engine was not more powerful, but its waste products, noise, heat, exhaust, were meticulously managed and minimized. It was a predator adapted to a single season, a seasonal weapon. But the most chilling deduction came from correlating the technical data with the tactical timeline. Alexei plotted the dates. The ice-licked order in November 44. Faber's sketches from January 45. The engagement on March 28th. They had one winter, he said, staring at the timeline. Just one. From first snow to the spring thaw of 1945. That was their operational window. After that, their camouflage becomes a liability, their special tracks inefficient on mud. They were built for a war that was ending, for a season that was turning. Thomas, on the screen, nodded grimly. He pulled up factory records. The components for these modifications, the specialized mufflers, the quartz additive, the complex heat exchanger units, they were produced in small batches at a subsidiary of the Mittelwerk. That facility was vaporized in a RAF area bombing raid on February 21, 1945. The records end. The tools, the jigs, the assembly lines, gone. The implication hung in the air, cold and absolute. The White Tigers were not just a secret unit. They were an evolutionary dead end. A masterpiece of military adaptation that reached the battlefield just as its ecological niche, the frozen hell of the German retreat, was collapsing. They were the pinnacle of a specialized branch of warfare that was about to be rendered extinct by the coming spring and the total Allied victory. They were, in every sense, ghosts of a dying season. This realization shifted the entire mystery into a darker, more tragic key.
The question was no longer just, what were they? But what was their purpose in those final futile days? They were too few to change the tide. Their technology was too niche to be replicated. So why deploy them at all? Why send a handful of invisible tanks into a collapsing pocket? Alexei looked at the ghost tiger emblem on the plate. It no longer seemed just fierce. It looked desperate. It was the face of a creature that knew it was the last of its kind, bred for a world that was melting away. The investigation had reconstructed the machine's anatomy in stunning detail. But the soul of the machine, the intent of its creators, and the fate of its crew remained locked in the final frozen days of March 1945. To find that, they needed to stop looking at the components and start following the order Ivan Petrovich had witnessed being executed. The silent, purposeful turn away from the battle and the disappearance into the blizzard. They needed to find out where the ghosts went when their war was over.
The reconstructed anatomy of the white tigers presented a brutal, logical conclusion. They were weapons without a future. This truth cast a long, dark shadow over their final actions. If they couldn't alter the strategic disaster, what was their tactical purpose in those last chaotic weeks? Alexei and Thomas now shifted their focus from the how to the why of their end. They needed to find the kill switch, the final command that consigned men and machines to legend. The search moved into the most opaque layers of the archive: signal intercepts, last known command chain fragments, and the dreaded paperwork of the SS and Gestapo, who in the final months exerted increasing control over all special projects with fanatical, destructive zeal. Thomas, leveraging contacts in the German Federal Archives, unearthed a fragment. It was a decrypt of a high-priority signal, sent via the Lorenz cipher from the F-Ra Hauptquartier on March 25, 1940, to Kommando JRG. The message was terse, brutal in its clarity. Projekt Nibelung. Den Untergang nicht beleben. Vollst in die Vernichtung nach letztem Einsatz. Keine Spuren. JRG verantwortlich. Project Nibelung. Must not survive the downfall. Complete destruction after final engagement. No traces. JRG responsible. It's a death sentence, Thomas said over the video link, his face pale on the screen. Not just for the tanks, for the project, for the knowledge, for everyone involved. But a follow-up signal, intercepted just hours later on March 26th from the same call sign, was different. It was shorter, sent in a lower-grade cipher, almost as if the sender was rushing or using different protocols. It read, Befehl verstanden. Schatz wird im Eis verwahrt. Order understood. Treasure will be preserved in ice. Two contradictory messages. One, a command from the crumbling heart of the Reich to erase all evidence. The other, an acknowledgement that twisted the order into something else. Preserved in ice, not destroyed.
Alexei's mind raced back to Ivan Petrovich's testimony. The engagement was March 28th. After disabling the guns, the Tigers had paused. Their commander had emerged, looked east, and then they had withdrawn. They had not pressed the attack to annihilation. They had disengaged. They were already executing a different plan. The key had to be J.R.G. himself. What did a commander like that do when given a suicidal order from a regime he knew was finished? The answer came not from a military archive, but from a private, digital museum of German family history. Thomas, searching for any trace of von J.R.G.'s extended family, found a scanned letter in a personal collection. It was from a younger cousin, a boy of 16, dated January 1945. The boy wrote of his admiration, asking about the war. A single, heavily redacted reply from von J. Argy existed. Most of it was blacked out by censors, but one line, perhaps deemed philosophical and harmless, remained. Der wahre Soldat kämpft nicht für den Sieg einer Idee, sondern für das Überleben seiner Ämter und die Wahrheit ihrer Tat. The true soldier does not fight for the victory of an idea, but for the survival of his men and the truth of their deed. Survival. Truth. These were not the words of a man planning a final fiery Jetermarung in obedience to a madman. This was a commander thinking beyond the end. Alexei turned to the Soviet side of the equation. If the Tigers were a high-value target that simply vanished, the NKVD would have taken notice. Using his grandfather's old connections and a formal research petition, he gained restricted, on-site access to a regional FSB archive, holding uncatalogued NKVD field reports from the East Prussian campaign. The air in the reading room was cold, smelling of dust and disinfectant. The files were brittle, their ink fading. He found it in a thick folder labeled UECII Adioye IDOU 1945. Unidentified Armor, April 1945. The report was typed on a captured German typewriter, the Cyrillic letters misaligned and jarring. It was from an NKVD Special Tasks detachment attached to the 2nd Guards Army. Date: April 3rd, 1945. At 14:30 hours, forward scouts from 3rd Rifle Battalion reported visual contact with a group of 4 to 5 enemy tanks, color white, moving in column at slow speed approximately 2 kilometers east of grid reference 48 to 71, heading in a northeasterly direction towards the Frischeshof Lagoon. Attempts to establish contact via loudspeaker and warning shots were met with no response. The column maintained strict radio silence and did not deviate from its course. Due to inability to identify unit and its movement towards a secured coastal sector, Detachment Commander Colonel V.P. Kirsanov gave order to disable rear vehicle with anti-tank rifle fire to force halt. The report described a single precise shot that struck the engine deck of the last tank. The column did not stop. The damaged tank continued under its own power, emitting a thin stream of grayish smoke, but keeping pace. The column moved, with a terrible, deliberate resolve, onto the frozen ice of the Frischeshof, the vast, shallow lagoon that separated the mainland from the Baltiskaya, Baltic Spit. The targets proceeded onto the ice field. Light artillery, 45 mm, was deployed on the shore. 6 rounds were fired. Direct hits were observed on 2 tanks. No catastrophic detonations occurred. The tanks did not return fire. They continued moving east, across the ice, into a gathering snowfall. Pursuit was impossible due to instability of the ice closer to shore and lack of appropriate vehicles. Aerial reconnaissance later in the day showed no sign of the column on the spit. It is the assessment of this detachment that the enemy unit, likely a specialized breakout or sabotage group, attempted a crossing to the spit and was lost due to battle damage and ice collapse. No recoverable materiel or prisoners. The final line was stamped in red. Nyo I saeduo. How dare you yodoa you a inyawe adoea. Case closed. Materials transferred to Special Archive. Alexei sat back, the brittle paper trembling slightly in his hand. This was it. The last confirmed sighting. They had been ordered to self-destruct. Instead, they chose exile. They took a different kind of death. Not by fire, but by ice. They drove their wounded machines onto the frozen lagoon, under artillery fire, refusing to surrender or stop, heading not towards enemy lines, but into a geographical dead end. the narrow, sandy spit. Treasure will be preserved in ice. It was not a metaphor. It was a literal destination, a frozen tomb of their own choosing. The pieces of the final order snapped together with dreadful clarity. Von J. Arg had received the command to destroy everything. He had acknowledged it, and then he had subverted it completely. He would not give his men or his machines to the flames of a suicidal regime. Nor would he let them become trophies for the Soviets. He would preserve them. He would bury the treasure of Project Nibelung, the evidence of its technical achievement, the truth of its men's sacrifice, in the one element that had been their ally and their identity, the ice. It was the ultimate act of a commander loyal not to a doomed state, but to his own twisted code of honor. He turned his unit into a ghost story, a mystery to be swallowed by the very winter that had given them birth. The silence Ivan Petrovich described was not just tactical. It was final. It was the sound of men and machines walking off the page of history into a white, permanent quiet. The NKVD report was a compass needle pointing into a frozen void. The Frisches Hof, now the Vistula Lagoon, was a vast, shallow basin. The idea of finding a handful of tanks lost on its ice or submerged in its silty bed 8 decades later was the definition of a fool's errand.
But Alexei was no longer just a historian. He was a man haunted. The ghosts had a commander, a purpose, and a last known trajectory. He could not let them rest. The breakthrough came from an unexpected synergy of old and new. Thomas, analyzing declassified Luftwaffe aerial survey maps of the lagoon from 1944 for coastal defenses, noticed faint, algorithmic annotations in the margins, grids and depth soundings that didn't correlate with standard nautical charts. They were hand-drawn, almost frantic. Bathymetric notations, Thomas concluded. Someone was obsessively mapping the underwater topography of the lagoon, specifically the channels and deep holes, in the middle of a war. Alexei cross-referenced these with modern sonar surveys conducted for a Polish-Russian environmental study on lagoon sedimentation. He overlaid the old German depth grids onto the modern sonar renders. In a sector 3 kilometers off the shore of the Baltiskaya Spit, the maps converged on an anomaly. The modern scan showed a deep, narrow trench on the lagoon floor, a glacial relic. The German annotations highlighted the same feature, labeling it Tiefe Rinne, deep channel, and scribbled beside it, in the same hand that wrote Project Nibelung, was a single word: Schatzkammer, treasure chamber. It was a hypothesis, fragile as the ice that had once covered the spot. But it was the only one they had. Securing funding and permits for a private underwater survey was impossible. But Alexei had one final card to play. He wrote a comprehensive report, weaving together the dog tag, Faber's sketches, Ivan Petrovich's testimony, the signal intercepts, and the NKVD document. He presented it not as a treasure hunt, but as a historical and forensic archaeology project to solve a documented wartime disappearance. He sent it to a contact at the Kaliningrad Regional History Museum, a man with a passion for military archaeology and the connections to access specialized equipment. The man, a retired naval officer named Dmitri, was skeptical until he saw the scan overlays and the NKVD report. The word Schatzkammer ignited a flame in his eyes. The lagoon guards its secrets, he said, but it gives up clues to those who know how to listen. We will listen with sound. A week later, on a gray, wind-swept morning that felt like a memory of 1945, Alexei stood on the deck of a small, chartered survey vessel. The Baltiskaya Spit was a thin, melancholic line of sand and pine to the east. The equipment was a compact, high-resolution side-scan sonar unit, towed behind the boat like a high-tech fish. Its pulses would paint a picture of the lagoon floor. Dmitri operated the console with a sailor's calm precision. The screen showed a monotonous tapestry of silt, sand, and occasional debris, sunken logs, lost fishing nets. For hours, they traced grid lines over the sector of the Tifarina. The tension was a physical weight. Then, the screen's gray-green monotony was broken. Not by the jagged outline of a tank, but by a series of perfect, geometric shadows. Long, rectangular shapes, aligned in a rough, staggered row. They were nestled at the edge of the underwater trench, as if they had come to rest on the lip of an abyss. The sonar resolved details: the distinctive sloping front of a panther glacis, the boxy silhouette of a hull, the rounded curve of a turret. 4 of them. One appeared slightly separated from the others, its outline more distorted, as if partially collapsed into the soft sediment. The 4th one, Dmitri muttered, zooming in. The one they hit from the shore. It must have taken the most damage, maybe broke through the ice last. But it was the 5th object that stole the breath from Alexei's lungs. It was not with the others. It was ahead of them, positioned at the very head of the formation. It was smaller, lower. A vehicle, a tracked vehicle, a Stay KF's 251 half-track, the ubiquitous transport of the German army. But its position was deliberate. It was not a wreck. It was a vanguard, or a hearse. Dmitri turned the boat, making another pass with even finer resolution. The image clarified. The tanks were not scattered randomly. They were in a defensive formation, a crescent, their guns facing back the way they had come, towards the shore, towards their pursuers. They had driven onto the ice, been shelled, and instead of scattering, they had assumed a final, defiant battle position. And then the ice, weakened by artillery fire and the weight of their machines, had given way. They had sunk, not in chaos, but in order. They had chosen their grave and descended into it as a unit. The discovery was monumental, but it was also a tomb. Raising the vehicles was a complex, costly, and arguably sacrilegious undertaking. But they had to see. They had to know. Using a remotely operated vehicle, ROV, equipped with lights and cameras, they returned the next day. The live feed from the depths was a journey into a haunting stillness. The lagoon's murky water filtered the light into a gloomy, greenish twilight. The first tank materialized from the gloom like a sleeping leviathan. The ice-licked paint was long gone, eaten by decades of microorganisms, but the steel hull was covered in a thick, fuzzy coat of brown algae and silt, giving it a grotesque organic appearance. Yet the shape was unmistakable. The wide winter tracks, the modified exhaust housing, now a corroded lump. And there, on the turret side, barely visible under the marine growth, was the raised outline of an emblem, the skeletal tiger. The ROV moved from one ghost to another. The damage was evident: cracked weld seams from near misses, a torn fender, a barrel bent downwards from the impact of hitting the lagoon floor. These were not pristine machines. They were veterans of a brutal short war. Then the camera approached the half-track at the head of the formation. Its rear doors were closed. The ROV's manipulator arm, with immense delicacy, brushed away a curtain of weed. The door was not just closed, it was welded shut. A crude, professional weld, done not in a factory, but in the field. And above the weld, painted directly onto the steel in paint that had somehow resisted the water, was a final message. 2 words, in the same sharp, precise hand they had seen on the archival maps. Hier wir schlafend. Here we, sleeping. The camera panned slowly across the silent, algae-shrouded crescent of armor, the welded half-track at its point. This was no accident. No desperate flight ended in disaster. This was a ritual interment. Von J.R.G. had led his men and their machines onto the ice, taken the punishing fire, and executed the final maneuver. They had formed their perimeter, sealed their commander's vehicle, perhaps with von J.R.G. and the project's core records inside, and let the frozen lagoon take them. They had chosen to be preserved, intact, as a time capsule of their own doomed endeavor. They had become their own memorial, hidden in plain sight at the bottom of a shallow sea. In the quiet cabin of the survey vessel, staring at the spectral images from 50 meters below, Alexei understood the full, terrible weight of the discovery. He had found the white tigers, not as rusting scrap, but as a funeral procession frozen in time. They were not lost. They were exactly where they intended to be. They had achieved the ultimate camouflage, not just invisibility in the snow, but oblivion in the deep. And in doing so, they had turned a military secret into a myth made real, a ghost story written in steel and silt at the bottom of a forgotten lagoon. The mystery was solved, but the haunting had just begun. The high-resolution sonar images and the ROV footage were irrefutable. They were also profoundly destabilizing. Alexei now possessed the coordinates to one of the most pristine, mysterious battlefield time capsules of the Second World War.
The pressure to act, to claim, to reveal, was immense and came from all sides. The museum saw a priceless exhibition centerpiece. Academic journals demanded a paper. Darker, less scrupulous entities from the shadowy world of militaria collectors made veiled, generous offers through back channels. The ghosts, it seemed, were a commodity, but Alexei felt a growing leaden certainty that to raise them would be a violation of a different order. He spent days in a state of quiet turmoil, revisiting every piece of evidence: Lucas Faber's youthful sketches, the desperate hope in his letters, Ivan Petrovich's haunted eyes as he described the silence, the cold, professional fury of von J.R.G.'s final, subverted order, the welded door and its stark declaration, Hier wir schlafend. This was not merely a find. It was a grave they had chosen, a statement they had made with their last conscious act. To drag them into the light of a museum, to be gawked at, analyzed, and debated, felt like the ultimate betrayal of their chosen fate. To be swallowed, not captured. Thomas, in Berlin, shared his unease but framed it practically. "They are war graves," he said during one of their final video calls, his face serious. "By international convention, by basic decency, that half-track is almost certainly a sarcophagus. We do not display sarcophagi. We respect them." This became Alexei's anchor. He, Thomas, and Dmitri from the museum formed an unlikely pact. They would not excavate. Instead, they would document and protect. Alexei authored a new, definitive report, but it was not a sensational reveal. It was a forensic and historical closure. He detailed the identification of Gefreiter Lucas Faber and the linkage to his family, providing Karin Weber with a final tragic answer and copies of her father's sketches. He formally cited the NKVD report and the signal intercepts to establish the circumstances of loss, and he presented the sonar evidence with a clear, powerful recommendation. The site was to be designated an official maritime war grave, off limits to salvage, a permanent resting place for Sonderkommando whey or tiger. The pushback was fierce. There were calls to secure the historical asset, arguments about the scientific value of the unique modifications. But Alexei, fortified by the moral clarity the ghosts themselves had provided, stood firm. He leveraged his grandfather's memory, Ivan Petrovich's testimony, and the raw, haunting power of the Hyr inscription. He argued that the greatest historical value lay not in the corroded metal, but in understanding the intent behind its deposition. To disturb it would destroy the very truth they had sacrificed everything to preserve. The authorities, after lengthy deliberation, agreed. The coordinates were classified. A quiet, unmarked maritime order was issued, creating a restricted zone over the Tieferinne. No anchoring, no diving, no sonar scanning. The white tigers were granted, at last, the permanent silence they had sought. The public story was different. Alexei and Thomas co-authored a restrained, powerful article for a major historical journal. It told the tale of Project Nibelung, the technical innovation, the human cost, the mystery of its disappearance. It published Faber's sketches and the text of the signals. It confirmed the eyewitness account of the final engagement. But it ended not with a triumphant, "We found them," but with a solemn, "They chose to disappear, and we have chosen to respect that." The article sent ripples through the historical community, not for a looted treasure, but for a completed narrative that honored the shadows. The final act was personal. Alexei returned alone to the shore of the Vistula lagoon on a clear, cold evening, the spit a dark line against a sunset the color of old blood. He carried no equipment, no camera. He stood facing the water, over the spot where the ghostly crescent lay 50 meters below. In his pocket, he held a replica of Lucas Faber's dog tag, which he had made for Karin Weber. She had asked him to keep one. He understood now what he had truly uncovered. It was not a weapon. It was a tragedy in 3 acts. The madness of creating a perfect weapon for a lost war, the humanity of the men forced to wield it, and the defiant, existential choice of a commander who refused both victory and surrender. The White Tigers were not a military secret. They were a philosophical one, a stark lesson in the futility of technological salvation in a moral vacuum, and the strange, stubborn honor that can sometimes emerge from the heart of the nightmare. He took the dog tag from his pocket, letting the cold metal warm in his hand. He thought of the young man who drew pictures, of the old artilleryman who never forgot the hum, of the aristocratic commander who chose an ice tomb over a fiery altar. They were all gone, their war long over, but their choice to vanish, to become a legend rather than a trophy, had endured. It had taken on a life of its own, and in a strange way, it had won. Alexei did not throw the tag into the water. That would have been a gesture for himself. Instead, he simply held it, looked at the calm, dark surface of the lagoon, and acknowledged the truth. They were not down there sleeping. They were exactly where they wanted to be. They had achieved the only objective left to them in the spring of 1945. They had left the stage of history on their own terms, wrapped in a silence so profound it had taken 80 years to hear its echo. He put the tag back in his pocket, turned his back on the water, and walked towards the darkening land. The investigation was closed. The file was complete. The ghosts could rest. And for the first time since he had brushed the moss from that white steel plate in the Lesnaya Grove, Alexei Volkov
felt the weight of their silence lift, leaving behind not answers, but a deeper, more resonant understanding of the past's unquiet depths.